Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everyone to the first of a series of talks organized by Italian Studies at St. Jerome's University. As our first speaker, we welcome Dr. Luca Cottini, who we're very pleased to welcome here. So I'm going to present Luca Cottini first, and then very briefly read the abstract for this lecture. And then our professor Andrea Privitera will also talk about how this lecture is also part of his course, Understanding Modern Italy, new course Italset 100. So our speaker today, whom we warmly welcome, is Professor Luca Cottini, Associate Professor at Villanova University, and host and creator of the YouTube show, which is having huge success all over North America and also in Italy, Italian Innovators. He holds a PhD from Harvard University, an MA from the University of Notre Dame, and a BA from the University of Milan. He was trained as a classical philologist in Italy and a cultural historian in the US. His interests touch upon Italian literature, visual arts, and intellectual history of the 19th and 20th century, and on the birth of Italian industrial culture, advertising, and design. His books include a monograph on Italo Calvino, I passaggi obbligati di Italo Calvino, published in 2017, and a cultural history of the origins of Italian design called The Art of Objects, the birth of Italian industrial culture, 1878-1928. By the way, I have it here, I'm reading it, it's amazing. Look, I love it. And we also have a copy in our library, the SJU library. So I invite you to check it out because it's brilliant. His YouTube work explores the Italian model of entrepreneurship and innovation through cultural profiles, interviews, and lessons across different disciplines. There is fashion, food, technology, sports, music, engineering. As we know, our university, the University of Waterloo, excels in the STEM and also in entrepreneurship. So these kind of ideas are really, really very important for our students. So the abstract, what is Professor Cottini going to talk about today? From the Renaissance to the 20th century, Florence was the birthplace of Italian fashion. In the Tuscan city, Italian Moda acquired its status as an independent style and industry in the post-war years. In Florence, artisans like Guccio Gucci, Salvatore Ferragamo, and Emilio Pucci gave new appealing forms to old crafts and heritages. In this presentation, Dr. Cottini explores their history and their impact, observing contemporary Italian fashion through a Florentine lens. Dr. Privitera, it's your turn to tell us about your course and how this fits in within your new course, Italset 100, Understanding Modern Italy.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you, Dr. Luca Cottini, for being here with us. It's truly a pleasure. Dr. Cottini's talk is part of Italset 100, Understanding Modern Italy, which we are offering online right now for the first time this term, fall 2022, and we're going to offer it online next term as well, winter 2023. This course explores the contradictory nature of Italy throughout the country's history between 1848, when Italy was not even a country, until 1994, the rise of Berlusconi to power. So the focus is truly the contradictions. So Italy, just to give some of the few contradictions that we are exploring in this course. Italy is a secular country, but with the Vatican at its doorstep, with the cradle of the Catholic Church at its doorstep. It's a member of the G7 countries, but with part of the country that is quite underdeveloped compared to other industrialized countries. It's an unitarian country, but with strong regional identities and even independentist movement as part of the history. It's the birthplace of fascism, but also the Western country with the most influential communist party during the Cold War. And also it's the country that won the 2021 Euro Championship, but was not able to qualify for the World Cup this year. So, which is the most annoying contradiction, I'd say, right now. But jokes aside, the main contradiction for this talk is, of course, the fact that Italy is a country that is politically and socially unstable, you might say, but also like a country with a very pervasive soft power and cultural appeal. And that's the kind of contradiction that we've been exploring throughout the course. by talking about the early development of Italian industry at the turn of the 1800s and 1900s, with the development of the Italian industry and cultural industry during the economic miracle, and with the affirmation of Made in Italy, of the Made in Italy brand in the 1980s, which is the topic of this week's modules, if you're part of the course. And I see that some of you here today are indeed part of the course. And of course, we cannot talk about Italian soft power and Italian industry without talking about Italian fashion. And that's something that indeed has captured the interest of many of the students in this course, given that I received final paper proposals discussing Italian fashion. And today's talk with Dr. Cottini is an excellent opportunity for us to explore this topic. On the Friday lecture, we discussed, we did a bit of a survey of Italian fashion from the 1950s until the 1990s, from its evolution from Florence to its birth in Florence until its boom in Milan. But today, with Dr. Luca Cottini, we're going to explore the beginning of fashion in Florence, in fact, through three particular figures. So, Dr. Cottini, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. And let me share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. Let me see if I can. Okay, can you see full screen? Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, really. I'm really delighted to be with you today and ideally take you to Florence. Not the Florence of calendar or Instagram pictures, but Florence as a lively cradle of style and industriousness, and as the birthplace of Italian fashion, which is a relatively recent project dating to the first show organized in Palazzo Pitti in 1951 by Giovanni Battista Giorgini, aimed at attracting American buyers and featuring the works of young designers Valentino Garavani, Valentino, Emilio Pucci, the Fontana sisters, and Guccio Gucci. So in this presentation, we'll investigate the stories of three fashion designers who started their artistic and commercial career in the city, transforming it into the fertile soil for the evolution of Italian moda. I will explore how the work of Guccio Gucci, Salvatore Ferragamo, and Emilio Pucci recreated the city's heritage in a modern key and launched the success of Italy's fashion, which took off and moved its headquarters to Milan in the late 1970s. Now, before starting, I feel a clarification is needed on the term Tuscan, which is a subcategory of Italian, of the way people use the word Italian. So Tuscan, or in its smaller version, Florentine, is an adjective that most menus include to make their products appealing. So Tuscan soup, Tuscan pizza, Tuscan oil, Tuscan whatever else you want to include there. So while the word Tuscan indicates in many instances a self-aggrandizing marketing term rather than a marker of cultural origin, we can certainly start from here to ask one simple question, which will lead our conversation today. Question is like, what does Tuscan add to a product? And I'll answer with a little anecdote from my own teaching experience. Now, one day in class, I told my student that certain labs managed to synthesize Tuscan oil with the exact same qualities and chemical bonds. It's actually true. And I asked them what they would choose between a true but expensive Tuscan oil and a lab-produced but cheap Tuscan oil. Now, the vast majority opted for the first option, but some went for the second, I have to tell you. But when they first told me they would pick the first option, I asked them why they would pick the real Tuscan oil. And I'll summarize their answers. Because of its story, its connection to traveling, nice calendar shots or of idyllic landscapes or the memories of a trip, its association to the Renaissance. So Botticelli's Primavera, Brunelleschi's Dome, Michelangelo, and so on. Now, the connections to food and art are inevitable additions when we refer to Tuscany, But I want to add two more here that might be of relevance. The first is tobacco. Tuscany is the land of Tuscan cigar, and its Manifatture Tabacchi, which were the headquarters of the greatest tobacco plant in Italy, have now been refurbished into an expositional space of fashion, a gallery of contemporary arts, and a creative hub. Certainly an interesting or alternative space to see in Florence the next time you'll go. The second aspect, and I'll dwell on this, is leather. We'll talk more about it with Gucci, but the backbone of the sector's success lies in a conglomerate of about 600 businesses north of Florence in the nearby city of Prato, which constitutes the so-called leather district, a network of pellettieri, like tanneries and leather manufacturing sites that fuels the success of Tuscan products and is really the backbone of Gucci, Ferragamo, and Pucci as well. Now, in our conversation today, we will explore the link of Tuscany and fashion, as expressed in the work of Guccio Gucci in connection to the leather district, in the work of Salvatore Ferragamo in connection to his choice of the city as a theatrical stage for his shoe business, and in the work of Emilio Pucci in connection to the humanistic and Renaissance heritage of the city. At the end of our chat, I will indicate 3 buildings to visit in your next trip to Florence in connection to their stories. So the Gucci Museum, the Ferragamo Museum, and Palazzo Pucci. Their spaces display not only the legacy and impact of the Florentine milieu upon Italy's 20th century fashion, but also an idea of fashion itself as art and of trends as mirrors of future eternities. Now, I'm sure you have watched the House of Gucci movie. Now, more than commenting on the plot, the acting, or the differences between fiction and reality, which seems to be like the national sport at this time, I want to reflect on 3 aspects that surround the narrative. You can find them in my upcoming episode of Italian Innovators, which I dedicated to Guccio Gucci, will come out on December 1st. Now, the first aspect is the relationship between branding and storytelling. So a genre of story branding, which aims to reconfigure shameful aspects of a company, so in this case, the in-house murder of Maurizio Gucci, into momentum builders, turning weakness into empathy or self-glorification. You find this dynamic also in the social network on Zuckerberg. My second consideration on the movie relates to the depiction of Italian family businesses in connection with petty rivalries or clan feuds. And this might be the case for Gucci, but there are many success stories of Italian family companies like Illy, Ferrero, Laura Biagiotti, Ermenegildo Zegna, which actually indicate the distinctive and successful nature of family ownership as a model focused on loyalty, sustainability, and long-term growth. Now, the third aspect I want to highlight in the movie is actually the absence of the story that precedes its fiction, which is the story about the company's founder, Guccio Gucci. Now, Guccio Gucci was the son of a leather craftsman from Florence. In the late 1890s, he traveled to London to learn English, see the world, get some work experience, and also move away from his family. In London, he worked at the Savoy Hotel, which was the city's most luxurious lodging and the first hotel in the world endowed with electric elevators, telephone prototypes, and electric lights. Pay attention here because this is really an inspiring story. Now, the young man worked in the hotel as dishwasher, waiter, concierge, and elevator attendant. So as he gave elevator rides to elegant upper-class hotel guests, he observed their luggage with curiosity. And in the brief interactions with celebrities and politicians on the elevator, he learned their style, clothing, accessories, jewelry, and manners. This is really the power of small talk. And it is here, in this context, that young Guccio first realized the coded language of leather bags. And he grasped the needs and wants of celebrities, sowing really the seeds of his later company. Now, building on his British experience and savings, Guccio decided to open his own luggage store in Florence in 1921. The house of Gucci really starts here, in the family-owned leather shop, where Guccio asked master Tuscan artisans to reinvent the elite designs of London luggage maker H.J. Cave. The store of Via della Vigna Nuova began by selling saddles and saddlebags for the local clientele, but quickly expanded beyond horse accessories, developing a portfolio of custom bags for the Florentine nobility and high-quality luggage for German and British travelers. The business rapidly expanded, so in 1938, Gucci opened a store in the exclusive Via dei Condotti in Rome, in front of the Spanish Steps. In 1951, it opened a location in Milano's Via Monte Napoleone, the street of fashion. And in 1953, his sons Aldo, Rodolfo, and Vasco opened a boutique in New York. Now, two circumstances launched the brand's transition from a local retailer in Florence to the global icon that we know. The first circumstance related to the embargo in the 1930s imposed by the League of Nations in 1935 in reaction to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and also Mussolini's self-proclaimed self-reliance from foreign imports, which is called autarky. The blockage of leather forced Gucci to ration production and test new solutions. And as he began to really experiment with alternative bags, woven with a special hemp from Naples, and printed with a series of small interconnecting diamonds in dark brown on a tan background. Now, these lightweight bags, which were printed with the repeating double G initials of Guccio Gucci, designed in 1933 by his son Aldo, would become the company's signature product. So, limit as a condition of resourcefulness and a stimulus for innovation. Now, the second defining event of Gucci's success relates to the post-war years and the release of the famous bamboo bag in 1947. Now, the bag, which is an all-time favorite of celebrities and royalty and still a hallmark of the brand, came out of the company's reappropriated equestrian vocation, as a saddle shape gave Gucci the inspiration to turn bamboo into an original handle. A traditional saddle girth would also be the inspiration for the green-red-green stripe, which de facto became the trademark design of the company over the following years. So experimental sourcing and memory reinvented. Now, the brand took off worldwide in the 50s as the Florentine aristocrat Giovanni Battista Giorgini invited Gucci to present his collection for American buyers in 1951. We talked about it earlier, the first fashion show. And as Guccio's son Aldo traveled to New York to promote the opening of the first American store. Now, the Gucci boutique would open in 1953, and 2 weeks later, Guccio Gucci would die. Now, Salvatore Ferragamo, the father of high heels, well, he was not originally from Florence, nor did he have any connection to Tuscany. He was from Avellino in Campania, but he decided to make the city of Florence the headquarters of his worldwide success in the endeavor to position his work within a context of art, eternity, and everlastingness. This is also the reason why the first Italian fashion show actually took place in Palazzo Pitti, the late 16th century palace, to really ground fashion not in ephemerality, but in the timelessness of arts. So fashion as a code for the present, and as in the Renaissance courts, where dresses spoke without speaking of the wealth, style, and temperament of their owners, and fashion also as an everlasting art. Now, the French poet Charles Baudelaire would explain this dynamic in The Painter of Modern Life, indicating the two beauties of our modern world, an ephemeral one, so fashion trend, and an immortal one, which is nothing but fashion distilled into art or distilled into eternity. Now, in a similar way, the Ferragamo story is about a contingent entrepreneurial path which was moved by his restless pursuit of distinction, and at the same time, an endless quest for timelessness, as we see on display today in the Ferragamo Museum. So Salvatore Ferragamo was the greatest designer of shoes of the 20th century. He was born near Avellino, Campania, Naples. And after his apprenticeship as a shoemaker in Naples, he moved to Boston in 1914, where his brother worked in a cowboy boot factory. After convincing his brother to move to California, he opened a shop for repair and made-to-measure shoes, perfecting his technique by studying anatomy at the University of Southern California and starting to design footwear for the rising cinematographic industry of Hollywood. Building on this capital of experience and knowledge and business, he returned to Italy in 1927 and decided to open his first store in Florence, launching one of the most iconic brands in global fashion. So Florence was chosen really to transform, it was a set really chosen to transform his products into immortal pieces. Ferragamo's celebrity grew with the popularity of his shoes. And in 1939, he really reintroduced the idea of the platform shoes. He was a creator of the wedge in the famous rainbow sandal that he designed for Judy Garland in honor of her performance in The Wizard of Oz. The rainbow shoe is also a byproduct of autarky, what we discussed before, as the limited availability of resources forced Ferragamo to experiment for the first time with Sardinian cork. So Ferragamo was one of the factors behind the emergence of high heels for women in 20th century fashion. Before him, and before steel, so the second factor I will discuss in a minute, heels were relatively low, and they actually were for men. The Ferragamo factor is self-explanatory. So in the 1950s, he designed a stunning collection of shoes for Marilyn Monroe, modeling her 4-inch heel as a timeless standard of fashion and elegance. The second factor behind the rise of the high heel is less obvious and relates to the metamorphosis of the stiletto from a wartime weapon to a fashion tool. So the stiletto was actually a stabbing blade, which medieval knights used as a secondary knife and gangsters use as a portable dagger. So the V42 stiletto produced in steel was a commonly used portable weapon for American soldiers during World War II. Now, the post-war application of steel to heels was a major change, as it allowed shoes to reach higher elevation and assume many more shapes. And in this sense, I like to think of the word stiletto in connection to its Latin origin stilus, which means pen, as an engraving tool, a writing instrument, stating not just a new canon of elegance, but also a self-confident philosophy and a no-compromise attitude. Now, in the case of Ferragamo, the design of a shoe is connected to the design of its style, its unique character, or in other words, its aura. There is nothing like Tuscany that can produce an aura, as we discussed in the beginning of our conversation. Now, the last example I want to introduce in our conversation is that of Emilio Pucci, where the Tuscan aura was not relegated to past folklore or heritage, but became a source of dialogue with the modern world and the platform to invent a completely different language of fashion. I described this creative path in the last episode I dedicated to Emilio Pucci. Now, born in Florence in 1914, Emilio spent his youth in the aristocratic 15th century palazzo of his family. Far from the temptation of taking shelter in his heritage, he actually participated in modern life as a gifted athlete and getting involved in politics prior to, during, and after the war. Now, his career in fashion started in the Reconstruction years, almost by chance, as he became an early artisan of the new Italian glamour and a recognizable designer of Dolce Vita. Pucci's kaleidoscopic style matured as a synthesis of Renaissance heritage, life experiences, and playful transfiguration of natural elements. Now, the Renaissance gave him the model for the design and printing of color. In the 15th and 16th centuries, at the time of the Pucci family's early fortunes, the manufacture and printing of textiles was in fact a major area of growth for the city, as the Medicis produced wool fabric and the Rucellais developed an effective glue for dyeing clothes. The most sought after and expensive dye was actually black, which in contemporary portraits did not indicate gloom, but rather status and wealth. The Renaissance was actually a byproduct of this growth of the textile industry and the expression of the city's new wealth, which was also driven by the establishment of banks. Differently from other cities, which display their power in the verticality of their cathedrals or towers or massive size of their public buildings, the economic prosperity of Florence found manifestation in color. So in the chromatic carousel of festivities, as described in the poetry of 15th century author Poliziano, or also in Lorenzo the Magnificent, or in the use of expensive pigments in painting, and in the different tonalities of marble adorning the cathedral. And lastly, in the precision and detail of fabric dyes and prints. So if you go past the Cathedral of Florence, look at the colors of the cathedral and think of like how many other churches have this variety of colors in their facade. Now, what Pucci did was to enliven this tradition in a modern key by animating color with surprising waves and natural vibrations, and by stretching printed fabric into dynamic and flexible garments. How? That's where his life experiences become a defining factor. Now, his path out of Florence, like that of Gucci and also Ferragamo, they all have in common the fact that they go out and they get back with a patrimony of experiences that they built. Now, for Gucci, his path out of Florence started in the Italian ski team of the 1932 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. So Pucci, the aristocratic, traveled to the New York Adirondacks to compete, but he was actually too young. He was 17 to actually take part in any race. He returned, however, to the United States a few months later. This was a really key experience for him, to study agriculture at the University of Georgia. And he would find permanent residence in the United States in 1935, when he was offered a full scholarship to lead the ski team of Reed College in Oregon. Reed College is also the college where Steve Jobs took the course of calligraphy that launched his later career. So keep in mind, this is an important name to remember. Now, Pucci earned an MA at Reed in political science in 1937, and then returned to Florence in 1938, where he actually earned a doctorate in political science at the University of Florence. Soon after, he actually joined the Italian Air Force. So this is kind of like quite an adventure as a story. During the war, he served as a pilot, receiving numerous decorations for his valor. And it was at this time that he got acquainted with Mussolini's daughter, Edda Ciano, becoming her confidant. Now, despite her rebellious temper and the fears elicited in suitors by her father, Edda had found a husband in Galeazzo Ciano in 1930, and as the husband was appointed Italian consul in Shanghai, she moved to China with him. At their return a few years later, Ciano became Minister of the Press and Propaganda, and then Minister of Foreign Affairs, presiding over the Italian invasion of Albania in June 1939. Now, in July 1943, as you might know, the Grand Council of Fascism voted Mussolini out of power, opening the path to his arrest, the German invasion of Italy, and the armistice with the Allies. This is actually an interesting anecdote that you might remember related to Florence. Hitler actually visited Florence in 1938 for the first time, and he really loved, like all the other tourists, Ponte Vecchio, the bridge, the old bridge crossing the Arno River, and he actually took a picture there. And this is the reason why during the war, when the Germans moved to Florence and bombed all the bridges, they bombed all but Ponte Vecchio. because Hitler was really fond of that bridge, like all the other tourists who took like the Instagram pictures. This being said, like in this story, when Hitler vetoed the proposal to rescue of Edda's of Mussolini's daughter Edda, to rescue Galeazzo Ciano by offering as a bargain his diaries, Hitler vetoed the scheme, and then Galeazzo Ciano was executed in 1944. Now, in all this story, Lieutenant Pucci played a key role because he was the one who helped Edda Ciano to escape to Switzerland, and he was the one who smuggled Ciano's diaries in her peasant clothes as a potential ransom for his life. And this was like he was the intermediary that delivered the letters to Hitler's officials, but his effort went without any successful outcome. Now, Pucci, for this effort, was actually arrested. He was brought to jail, and he was tortured in vain by the Gestapo. He actually later managed to escape and found a way to Switzerland, where he stayed in the years after the war. Now, Pucci's disparate experiences as an aristocrat, athlete, and war spy actually found an unexpected outlet in 1947, when, while he was in Switzerland, he designed a one-piece ski suit for a friend based on some project he had developed for the ski team at Reed College. Now, the suit was the first ever design in a one-piece stretchable fabric. And photographer Tony Frissell sent a picture of Pucci's friend wearing it to the editor of Harper's Bazaar. And immediately Pucci received from him the commission of a full skiwear collection, which was featured in the winter 1948 issue of the magazine and immediately captured the attention of international audiences. So Pucci starts with ski and then goes into fashion. Only after this success, he decided to leave the Air Force and set up a haute couture line in Capri in 1949, where he applied his knowledge of stretch fabrics and brightly colored prints to swimwear. The following year, he designed his first collection of wrinkle-free dresses and opened his boutique in Rome. And in 1951, the date that we stressed before, his work would be featured at the first fashion show of Florence, once again. This show exposed the work of young Italian talents and turned the complex simplicity of Italian style into a coherent glamour. The style of Pucci's Dolce Vita, then, is a synthesis of Florentine heritage and Capri allure, and his colorful fabrics would become a trademark of Italian elegance in the 1960s, especially in the United States. Marilyn Monroe would be repeatedly photographed with Pucci dresses, and she was actually interred wearing one. Pucci's success in the United States led him to author 6 collections of uniforms for brand flight attendants, pilots, and crew. So again, the return to aviation. And he was the one who designed the patch for the Apollo 15 mission to the moon. The same years, he was elected to the Italian parliament, so the passion for politics, as a conservative deputy for the Liberal Party, and continued his work in Florence, which remained the capital of Italian Moda until the 1970s. So in 1972, when Pucci finished his second parliamentary term, the city hosted the debut of young designer Laura Biagiotti, launching her successful career. She's one of the top brands in Laura Biagiotti. She was the first Westerner to ever present a fashion show in Beijing in 1988. So it's quite an important figure. Her career was launched in the same Sala Bianca that you see of Palazzo Pitti, where Pucci first started. So what made Pucci's style unique over the years was actually the ability to effortlessly combine modern and old influences. So sports gave him space to experiment with stretching fabric. Aviation gave him vision from above of natural spaces and the fluid lines of the sea. So the crystalline waters of Capri's Grotta Azzurra gave him inspiration for turning colors into wavy fantasies, and flower bouquets actually gave him the cue to draw ingenious chromatic associations for jerseys, silk scarves, and suits. All this search for natural colors, delightful combinations, and vivacity of style found rootedness in the Renaissance exuberance of color and in the Florentine art of dyeing and printing fabric. The secret recipe of Pucci's success lies in this mix of pattern and color, stretchable fabric and detailed prints, modernity, moda, and Renaissance, so everlastingness, which gave form to the joy and art of Italian living as the ultimate expression of a meaningful and dynamic beauty. Now, as you might know, in the 1980s, the epicenter of Italian fashion moved to Milan with the emergence of the pret-a-porter system, the new logo culture, and the rising popularity of designers like Giorgio Armani, Gianni Versace, Gianfranco Ferré, Ottavio Missoni, Domenico Dolce, and Stefano Gabbana. Here is a picture that was taken in 1985. Laura Biagiotti is the first on the left. Now that Milan is actually one of the world's capitals of fashion with Paris and New York and London, we might ask then, in light of what we said, what is the legacy of Florence on this Italian success? What momentum did Florence provide to launch the movement of Italian moda? Now, the 3 fashion museums that I invite you to visit in the city can give us an initial answer. So the legacy of Florence consists in the history of entrepreneurship and art, which we discussed. So Palazzo Pucci that you see, the 15th century palace, is now the archive of the company. The Museo Ferragamo hosts the most iconic pieces of the tailor's imagination. And it's not a permanent collection. It's a collection that keeps changing in a way to maintain this sense of dynamic beauty, everlasting but dynamic at the same time. And the Gucci Museum showcases the history and evolution of the brand. In addition, the Gucci Museum also stages a lively installation of the house's complex ramifications and creative interactions with the larger cultural environment, as powerfully exemplified by the restaurant space inside the premises, which is run by Italy's top chef. It was actually the world's top chef in 2016 and 2018, Massimo Bottura. So Florence gave fashion a cultural heritage, the status of art, and also a malleable intellectual language. This is an installation of Pucci, the Battistero design with Pucci visual identity in front of the cathedral that we discussed before. So Florence turned fashion into a shared patrimony, as expressed in the typically Italian idea showcase commercial pieces into the space of museums and not in retail or flagship stores. So an explicit endeavor to construct their value in economic and intellectual terms. We also see this effort to turn an ephemeral piece into an eternal piece in two other cases. One is the Museo Campari, the drink in Sesto San Giovanni near Milan, or in the Olivetti store, the typewriters, under the porticos of St. Mark's Piazza in Venice. So where the objects are displayed not as products, but as pieces of a museum. So eternity and ephemerality. Now, the entrepreneurial patrimony of Florence lies in this history that precedes the success of Italian fashion, a history of craft, creativity, and glamour from the leather shop of Gucci, dating back to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany from the 18th century that started the tradition of leather manufacture, to Ferragamo's choice of Florence as his city, from Pucci's art to the launching event of Palazzo Pitti in 1951. At the same time, Florence also provided fashion with the patrimony of a story, a milieu, a soil which made imagination fervid and design rich. It may seem irrelevant, but as we said in the beginning, talking about Tuscan oil, it is the magic that surrounds an object that creates an object. Design, as for storytelling, is about endowing objects with that plus value, with something more that makes an item not just an item, but rather a narrative, emotional, and entirely human platform. Now, if we start from this premise, Then Florence represents an ideal platform for the creation of new ideas and an open laboratory of living crafts and arts. Ferragamo connected his activity to Florence to ground its innovative shoemaking in order for it not to fade, but rather stay and continue to shine like the classic pieces of the Renaissance. Pucci found in Florentine heritage a vital repository of patterns, motives, inspiration, which he reinvented in dialogue with modern lifestyle. Gucci found in Tuscany a network of skills, which developed since the medieval and Renaissance construction of communes and signorie. That is the case of all of Italy, where every city was a capital city, and as such needed to build its distinctive ways of cooking, tailoring, building, writing stories. And this soil of affirmation of diversity for each city created the competition to cultivate new knowledge, nurtured excellence, and produce a remarkable diversity of arts, trades, and skills. Now, against this context, Florence represents then an ideal soil of fashion. It represents an ideal soil of fashion as self-exhibition and eternity, trendy affirmation and future duration, dynamism and groundedness. I hope you can understand now that Gucci is not only the movie, the Ferragamo is not just a brand, the Pucci is not just an icon of creativity. If we truly go back to their soil, we can detect and rediscover not just their tuning power, elaborate luxury, and sophisticated vitality, but also their idea of fashion as a language of trendiness and tradition, ephemerality and legacy, celebrity and immortality. Thank you. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. And if you're interested in knowing more about the Italian Innovators project, here are some useful links for you. Thank you. And I'll be glad to take any comment and question you might have about this presentation.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
No, go, Andrea.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Cottini, for this wonderful presentation. And well, like, first of all, like, I invite everybody who has a question, like, for Dr. Cottini to post them in the chat, or to prepare them. Like, if you feel comfortable speaking, you can also open your mic in a bit. Like, while you think about your questions, I have one question for Dr. Cottini myself, and the question is, like, it seems that these designers that we discussed today, like, they clearly always had in mind like this, like, how to bring tradition to the fashion industry, or like since the very beginning. But what I find particularly curious is the fact that yeah, there was no system of Italian fashion up until the 1950s, right? Like that kind of a thing. And what I'm wondering is, like, did people like Ferragamo, like Pucci, like Gucci, think that Italy could become a fashion, like it could have a fashion industry when they started? Was it the plan? Was it like a vision that they had, or were they, like, at the beginning, were they thinking of how to introduce these suggestions from Italian culture into an international market?
Well, thank you for the question. Like, until the 1950s, really, French was dominated, fashion was dominated by French style. And this has been the case since the 18th century. And also in the early 20th century, there was some attempt to create an independent Italian fashion. The problem is, how do you distinguish yourself? And before the 1950s, there was a particular moment of distinction that paradoxically came from fascist nationalism. So fascism in the 1930s was the first, put in place the first attempt to create an Italian fashion. And also an Italian design. So the Ente Nazionale della Moda, the National Agency of Fashion, was created in Turin in 1936 by fascism. And in the same year, Cesare Meano wrote the dictionary of fashion as a way to create Italian terms for what was only a French vocabulary to address fashion. Now, this was done by fascism in order to affirm the national character of Italian fashion, and again, with a nationalistic lens. But this move actually had an unexpected consequence, which was that of forcing Italian designers and fashion designers to actually think about what constitutes Italian fashion in opposition, as opposed to French fashion. So in this sense, Florence provided an interesting environment also in the late after the war, when there was this push to affirm an Italian originality, because Florence in the Renaissance provided this sense of fashion as a language. As I was hinting to, in the Renaissance courts, dresses were codes. People were not allowed to speak, but they could speak non-verbally through their clothes. So there was a way of speaking, which was then named by Baldassare Castiglione sprezzatura, so effortless sophistication, graceful ease. There was a way of speaking through your clothes, but not in an arrogant way. And this was taken as an example because, like, if you think about French fashion is all about chic. It's all about lavishness. It's all about like the preciousness of materials. Italian fashion creates itself instead as a simple complexity, a sophistication that arrives effortlessly. So in this sense, this creates in all of these figures, Florence is a key point of reference also for this kind of language of fashion that you see, for example, in painting, 16th, 17th century painting. But this language of fashion that becomes simple, clear, but also very sophisticated. And that's kind of the key still nowadays of the success of Italian fashion. Now, despite these attempts, early 20th century, there was like Rosa Genoni, one of the early pioneers of fashion, who actually designed a Primavera dress based on the a reinvention of Botticelli's Primavera painting, to the 1930s, when there was this attempt to create an Italian language of fashion vis-a-vis the French, to the 1950s, when this became explicit in the 1951 parade, when Giorgini actually convoked all these American buyers to showcase this new language of these young designers and promote it. Because to say it's one thing, to showcase this is another. And so that's where really the industry took off and went beyond the personal initiative of a few individuals and became really what is now, which is a system. That is called, people call it the system of Italian fashion. So. Grazie.
Thank you, grazie. Roberta, you have a question?
Lots of ideas. Punti. Now, I was particularly interested in this parallelism between Renaissance Florence and Florence in the 50s, post-World War II Florence, right? And in both cases, there's an event which brings about hardship, right? So post-bubonic plague Florence and the post-World War II Florence. And then what emerges from the relationship between, in the case of Renaissance Florence, the relationship between the bottegai and the international merchants. In the case of post-World War II Florence, the relationship between those who work in the workshops, the leather workers, and a budding entrepreneur like Pucci. So I'd like you to elaborate more. And what you mentioned, which was really interesting, the limit, how the limit acts as catalyst to creativity. I love that.
Thank you. And I would expand on what you said, not just on the moment of crisis, but on the crisis of the whole century, in the sense that, like, the Renaissance, or what we know as the Renaissance, is a particular period of incredible flourishing in the art, but also incredible crisis in politics. The 16th century, for the first 65, 70 years is a century of continuous warfare. Now, I like to compare this situation of the 16th century of continuous warfare that leads to this creative urgency to what happens in Italy after 1945, after the war. If you think, actually, Andrea mentioned it before, the situation of Italy politically is a situation of perennial crisis. We are at the, I don't remember if the 66th or 67th cabinet of Italy after World War II, which indicates that we are kind of at an average of 1 year, 1.5 maybe years per cabinet. So in this situation of constant political crisis, we also witness a similar situation of the Renaissance, of incredible flourishing boom of design, fashion, arts in Italy, despite, or actually thanks to this crisis. So in this sense, I see crisis not as an obstacle, but really as a moment that forces you to adopt your creativity more. We see this, maybe they are unrelated to fashion, but there are two examples that might illuminate my point. One is related to, well, a Tuscan setup that you might know, Collodi, The Adventures of Pinocchio, where the poverty of Geppetto is actually the condition for him to develop something truly lively, like Pinocchio, and unexpected. So in this sense, the urgency is the condition to develop a new idea. We see also this in cooking. North American cooking is about like the main chunk of the ingredient, whereas Italian cooking is about the creative use of leftovers, of a poor cuisine that is able to adopt poverty not as a condemnation, but as a resource to think of a solution. So in this sense, limit and crisis as creative resources. The last example I want to make is about the Italian language of gestures. Everybody knows that Italians make a lot of gestures, and when they speak, I could probably do the same. But this language really developed out of a situation of continuous subjugation of Italians. Italy became a nation in 1861. Before then, it was a constant domination by all foreigners, influences, Spaniards, French, Germans, British, Americans, also Canadians, set foot in Italy or established their kingdom in Italy. Now, in this context, you have to imagine that Italians had to develop a kind of a secret underlying language that forced them out, forced them to create a communication outside the circles that the dominators could not understand. So in the sense, I like to think of the language of gestures as this incredible creativity born out of the necessity to communicate without being understood by the dominator from time to time. So in this sense, also clothes speak the same language, and clothes are ways to bypass sometimes situations that are imposed. We mentioned earlier Laura Biagiotti, that uses fashion as a way of cultural diplomacy. In Beijing, she was actually the first Western woman to present in Moscow in 1995, and the first to present in Cairo in 1998. So once again, crisis or necessity or autarky or imposition of sanctions as a condition to develop new languages. So this is peculiar of Italy. Grazie.
Any questions for Dr. Cottini? Gabriel Nicoli.
Yes, Dr. Cottini, thanks so very much for this fascinating talk. You really allow me to connect a number of thoughts I've always had about literature and fashion and the arts and so on. I was just wondering, listening to you, that one of my conclusions from this talk was that indeed, as we say in Italian, l'abito fa il monaco, and not the other way around, in terms of the self, of the gender selves, in terms of identity and so on. My question is, to see if I can formulate it properly, is would it be fair to say that Italian innovators, now in this case, in the fattispecie in fashion, are never really excessive in their innovators, like other innovators from other countries? I can think in Italy, for instance, of this excessiveness in the Baroque, and to a minor extent in the scapigliatura, futurismo, and things of the sort. But is it fair to say that Italian innovators are conscious and always aware of the winning formulas which were established and coded in the Florentine humanism of the Quattrocento, and then codified, perfected by people like Bembo in language, and Della Casa and Castiglione, whom you mentioned, with the sprezzatura and so on. In other words, that they never go out of their way because they know that their ideas are embedded in such a winning formula that we Italians established in our Florentine hub of humanism. And it also brought to mind the idea that the Italian innovators, perhaps more than any other colleagues in other countries, always base their ideas on the old Horatian formula of an item, in this case, fashion, which is both, useful, that overused idea of the usefulness, and the aesthetics of the item. I don't know if I were able to formulate these ideas to you, but is there an element of truth in what I've just said, or am I completely off the margins here?
Well, thank you for the comment and the questions, and I'll try to pick up on two elements. The first is I'll quote a phrase not by a fashion designer, but like a great Italian innovator, Sergio Pininfarina, coach designer for cars, and his recipe for innovation was synthesized in this simple phrase that he used to say, which is innovare ma non troppo, to innovate but not too much, which and indicates...
I drove one of his cars, by the way, the old
fantastic.
Spider.
That is fantastic. So in this sense, this might apply to fashion as well. The recipe of success is rooted in this awareness of innovation as something that introduces a new variant on an old jingle, if you want. But this also indicates, if I were to compare this with the North American model of way to innovation, to kind of a difference in paradigm in innovation. So here in the US or in Canada, innovation relates to a pioneering paradigm. So the idea of passing the border, passing the boundary, and always going west. This was kind of the winning of the West and going into space, and when the West on the Earth was over. So the idea of the West as the horizon of new discoveries, of innovation. In the North American Anglo-Saxon paradigm. The Italian paradigm, and I go back to Pininfarina, is the idea of moving backward to move forward. So the idea of rediscovering a heritage as a way to find in the heritage not a museum of pieces, but really what Gio Ponti, the father of Italian design, called the occult forces that once set tradition in motion. So in the sense, to go back to heritage means to go back to what moved heritage in the first place, and find in those vital energies the propelling force to create new forms in a new modern key. So in the sense, innovare ma non troppo, going backwards to move forward. And this is an interesting approach to tradition, which doesn't venerate or worship tradition or worship ashes, but finds in tradition the momentum. Actually, tradition comes from the verb tradere, in Latin, which is really literally to pass the baton. So when you pass the baton in a relay race, you need to have momentum. So in this sense, tradition coincides with that momentum that gives force and newness and freshness to the objects. And this is probably the recipe of the Italian way to innovation. The other comment is on the word abito that you used. That is a word that is very dear to me because it means both dress and habit, in the sense like practice of life. It might mean also psychology, like a temperament. So in this sense, I go back to one of my stories that I trace in Italian Innovators of Milena Canonero, who is the most awarded costume designer of Hollywood. She's the only one who won 4 Academy Awards in 4 different decades. She worked for Kubrick. She did like Grand Hotel Budapest, and she was the one who designed Chariots of Fire, like, you know, the costumes of Chariots of Fire. She had this idea of the abito as a psychology, as a temperament. So not the abito as the wrapping of a character, but really as the platform that gives a character its own personality, its own specificity. So in this sense, all Italian fashion is about creating abiti. So dresses that create a personality, that create a way of being. And this is the same idea, once again, of Pinocchio, of turning a piece of matter into a lively piece of matter. So the dress, in this case, fabric, becomes kind of a lively actor, a temperament. So innovare ma non troppo and the tension to transform an object into an actor are 2 key formulas of Italian success and Italian innovation, or the Italian way to it. Grazie.
Grazie a lei.
Grazie and thank you. Like I think we are at time. Like we are a bit over time, I think, in fact. Like, but may I invite Luca Cottini for an informal chat, like after the as we stop the recording, like to see if anybody wants to have wants to ask you like a question about your the presentation, or like do you have time? Do you think you have time, Luca?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If you want to turn it off, like the recording, and we're a little bit freer.
Okay, perfect.
Intimidate.
So I will thank those who are watching this in the recording, and thank everybody who participated here. And I hope this is going to be the first of many lectures, of many guest lectures in the Italian Studies Department and Italian Studies Department at St. Jerome. Thank you, everybody, and I'm going to stop the recording, and bye-bye.